Hi, everyone. We're so happy you're joining us here today. We'll begin shortly. We'll just give everybody some time to fill the room. We're really excited that you are joining us for this, our first Asian Latinx or Asian Pacific Islander Latinx Festival. So we'll just give folks a little bit of time to settle in, maybe get home from work or stop their work from home, grab a snack, maybe grab a glass of water, and then we'll go ahead and begin. So again, we will begin shortly. I'd just like to let you know that if you have any questions, we will be opening it up at the end for a Q&A with both Sergio and with Fran, and you can enter those questions either into the chat box or into the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom browser. So we'll just give folks 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll go ahead and start. And before we begin with our welcome and start with the bios for our participants, I would like to invite Fran to give a land acknowledgement, please.
My ancestors will ask, how will they recognize me today? My answer is, acknowledge the people of the land that you are a guest of. I am currently residing in Long Beach, and I acknowledge and honor the Tongva people as the stewards of the land before we came to live here. Thank you for receiving us. I invite you to use the chat to tell us where you are dialing in from and acknowledge the first stewards of the land that you now live. Saina Masi.
Thank you so much, Fran. So hi, everyone. I'm Gabriela Martinez. I'm Director of Education at the Museum of Latin American Art. And on behalf of the rest of the museum staff, I'm so happy to welcome you to Eating Up Easter, the second in a series of programs organized for MOLA's Asian and Pacific Islander Latinx Festival. Through this festival, we explore the instances of cultural synthesis between Asian, Pacific Islander, and Latinx communities in the US and throughout Latin America. And we are grateful to be joined in this project by our event partners, the Japanese American National Museum and the Pacific Island Ethnic Art Museum. MOLA counts on the support of the Robert Gumbiner Foundation, the Arts Council of Long Beach, and the City of Long Beach. And tonight's program, Eating Up Easter, will feature Fran Lujan and Sergio Rapu. Fran will present Oceania 101, and then we'll talk to Sergio about his documentary, Eating Up Easter. So Fran Lujan is Museum Director and Curator of the Pacific Island Ethnic Art Museum in Long Beach, California. An indigenous Chamorro woman from the Pacific Island of Guam, Fran is the granddaughter of an indigenous master blacksmith and member of an extended family of cultural practitioners and artists. She's inseparable from her bloodline. In her presence and practices, Fran honors her Pacific Islands ancestors and uplifts all indigenous peoples in roots and in roots. Sergio Rapu is a native Rapa Nui producer and director who has spent the last 15 years producing documentaries, specials, and series that have aired on History Channel, Travel Channel, Discovery, National Geographic, and PBS. As one of the only native Rapa Nui working in production in an English-speaking country, he seeks to foster Indigenous producers throughout the West. Through his work, Sergio aims to show the complexity of life through thought-provoking media in order to inspire resolutions to social, economic, and environmental conflicts. And we're so excited to have him with us here tonight. So you can go ahead, Fran.
Arturo, I'll have you share the screen. And I have been asked to do a broad of Oceania 101. And I start with the ocean in us. One of our beloved scholars and friend, Teresa Tewa, said, "We sweat and cry salt water, so we know the ocean is really in our blood." Next. There is a world of difference between viewing the Pacific as an islands in a far sea and a sea of islands. So today's lesson is for me to tell as much truth as I possibly am allowed to share. There are about 1.2 million United States residents who are identify themselves as Pacific Islanders, and over 50% of those Pacific Islanders live in California, including myself. We haven't often been categorized as too small to count, yet our communities are anchored in the Pacific Ocean, which is the Earth's largest and deepest ocean. Our heritage comes from over 20,000 islands, which holds approximately 20% of the world's language. So given that immensity of our Pacific Islands, it becomes absurd for any lecturer to be in a position of authority on the region. We are in constant learning. So that's a broad, and so understanding our deeper lesson. Sergio, I'll go to the next slide. And this is the broader of understanding our deep family of Pacific Islanders, that there's a common idea that the history is equal or defined as the written record is actually a problem. So the earliest writings of Pacific Islanders were composed in the 1521 of European encounters of the people of Guahan, which I am from. And that may not seem a long time for a lot of people, but considering the people who have lived in here for thousands of years, and certainly well before the arrival of the Europeans, these writing systems do not speak our truth. So what's in the name? And this is where it really matters of why we have Sergio and Rapa Nui. I hold them in my heart. So we have been imposed a series of geographical, political mapping, names of our places and our people. And the biggest ones that stand out are the labels of Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia have been well established among many of our scholars and colonial administrators and governments, and over time, even our community itself. But let me tell you what those words mean. And I do not lift the name up of that mapping cartographer who popularized it. So the word Nesia comes from the word Nessos, which actually means islands. So it's actually not in all brilliance that you think this is such a smart. So Polynesia means many islands. Micronesia means small islands. So, and then for this very specific broad name is why I don't lift that person's name up. Is that they named the grouping of islands of Melanesia by the people's skin color. Who does that? And then if you look at a big map of Oceania and you see those divisions, you will recognize that sometimes out of that Polynesian triangle, they do not circle Easter Island, Rapa Nui, but clearly family, we just start with that language. The ocean is in us. There's only us and us. So that mapping system has really, we are in flux of that change. So Arturo, next slide. I would like to share a poem with you, and you can also find her on YouTube. And she's a brilliant poet, and she talked about, and this is the mapping, and it's called the Atlas. And we'd love to read it to you if you permit me. If you open up any atlas, these are just a few phrases I'm going to save this poem. If you open up any atlas and take a look at the map of the world, almost every single one of them slices the Pacific Ocean in half. To the human eye, every map centers all the land masses on Earth, creating the illusion that water can handle the butchering and be pushed to the edges of the world, as if the Pacific Ocean isn't the largest body living today, beating the loudest heart, the reason why land has a pulse in the first place. When people ask me where I'm from, I don't believe them. They don't believe me when I say water. So many of us come from water, but when you come from water, no one believes you. Colonization keeps laughing. Global warming is grinning at all your grief of how you mourn the loss of a home that isn't even gone yet. That no one believes you're from until they remember just how vast your ocean is, how microscopic your islands look in it, and how easy it is to miss when you're looking at the map of the world. So we ask you to receive us. And this is what a prayer to the Pahu that is temporarily residing at the Pacific Island Ethnic Art Museum as part of our Pacifica transmission programming. And every month, an artist, a practitioner of Indigenous bloodline is in space and having a relationship with one of our ancestral pieces so they can listen and remember what our ancestors are telling them. So this piece, have play it is by Alawea Monipili in response to the Mapakahu. It would be after the, not the bird patch, the next one.
Wamau ke'ea o ka'aina I ka pono. The spirit of the land is perpetuated with righteousness. Wamau ke'ea o ka'aina. O ka'aina I ka pono. Wamau ke'ea o ka'aina. O ka'aina. O ka'aina I ka pono.
Thank you for receiving Aloea, Moni Pili, and the Pahu. So when people ask about Oceania, the ocean is in us. And before I pass it over to Sergio, I'm going to bring in some recent news because it's an opportunity for me to talk about our ocean and recent news, and it's not in the slide that I'm going to talk about. There's a decision that just happened recently. Japan is about to dump over 1 million tons, and that's metric tons, which is heavier than the regular tons, of wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean. Just want you to think about that. This decision completely disregards the human rights and interests of the people in Fukushima, the wider Japan and Asia Pacific region, and my island home. Guam is only 2 hours away from Japan. While it is said that it will take about 2 years to prepare for that discharge, the decision allows radioactive waste discharge process to begin now. So my heart is breaking. So it's been a very emotional week because that news is hitting us all hard. And we don't have any decisions. We're trying. So there's a lot of questions, and there's a resource that would be put up on the chat. So you would like to know more about our Pacific studies, there is a 4 sequence that talks from colonization to our environment to our art, available on Scholarshare on University of Hawaii. So as I open in prayer, I close in prayer. The Creator remembers, grandmother to the north, south, east, and west. People remember, land remembers, the ocean remembers. Sanamasi.
Thank you so much, Fran. And I especially want to thank Fran for connecting us with Sergio initially. In planning this program, we thought what better resource than to kind of tap into our sister museum across the street. And Arturo and I had the opportunity to visit Fran when we started talking about this program, and we were able to get a personalized Oceania 101 there in the museum with all of the ancestors present, and it was such a moving experience. So thank you so much, Fran, for all of that. And now we will start our conversation with Sergio. So Sergio, I'm going to give you the option. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself. I have a couple of questions about you, or did you want to maybe jump into the film immediately? What would you prefer?
Oh man, I don't really like talking about myself, so let's just jump into the film.
Okay. So I've selected a handful. But I have plenty of questions about you, so we'll jump back to that at the very end. But I've selected a handful of clips from the film, and for those of you who are joining us, if you have not yet watched the documentary, it's absolutely beautiful. It was so touching. I've watched it a few times now this week in preparing for this program. And I really appreciated a lot of the themes that were highlighted in the topics that you touched upon that I think are important also to a lot of Latinx communities. And that includes colonization and the struggle over resources, globalism and effects on Native communities, economic reliance on tourism and the lack of control of production of goods, in a way, trading in your culture for much needed revenue, and then thinking about the way that outsiders interpret your culture and the effects of that, right? So let's start, because this is the Asian Pacific Islander Latinx Festival, and the reason we talk about Rapa Nui kind of in connection to Latin America is because it is so connected to mainland Chile. So let's start with there. The promotional video that we created includes this clip where Enrique reflects upon the tensions between the island and Chile and also hints at a bit of generational trauma. So let's watch the clip, and then I have a couple of questions about the relationship between the two countries for you.
Y por otro lado también, Rapa Nui casi nunca se ha tenido mucho entendimiento con el gobierno de Chile. Hay mucho dolor, hay que nos robaron estos papeles, esto otro, que hay mucha pena en nuestra gente. Eso nos duele mucho porque estamos agarrando la mochila de nuestros padres, de nuestros abuelos, sobre nosotros, sobre nuestra espalda.
So can you, as somebody from Rapa Nui, can you describe the relationship? I think one thing that I learned in watching your documentary is that I had absolutely no idea about Rapa Nui because I had heard that narrative that had been built up from the outside. So do you want to give us a little perspective into the relationship between the island and Chile, and maybe talk about how the politics or issues on each location has affected the other?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, before I start, I really just wanted to thank Gabriela and you folks, and also Auntie Fran. I mean, that the presentation and sort of talking about the world and geography as you did, sort of like was really emotional for me. Just to kind of give you and everybody in context, I'm not on Rapa Nui. This is not what it looks like. I am currently based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, in sort of this Pacific diaspora, right? Like there are so many of us that do not live on the island that we are from, or the island nations that our ancestors lived in. And so this is also the case for me. Rapa Nui, just to kind of give some kind of like political context, Rapa Nui is part of Chile. We are a province of Chile, and we essentially fit into a region within the country. So it's similar to, if you could imagine a town in the US, but is completely in the Pacific Ocean. And that town is within a state on the mainland that is governed by a federal government. So the layers for Rapa Nui in terms of representation, there's like several layers there. It's not, we don't have a senator that is Rapa Nui. We have senators that sort of represent us within sort of Chile and things like that. But thankfully Chile, for the most part, has been somewhat receptive of Native issues and of Indigenous voices. But oftentimes, we'll get the question of well, are you Chilean or are you Pacific Islander? right? Because we're in that gray zone in between these two circles. And the truth is that our passport is Chilean, but culturally and in many ways spiritually and emotionally, we are of the Pacific. We are of the ocean, as Auntie Fran says. And oftentimes like that clash is so clear, where there are Chilean citizens, immigrants that, or not immigrants, I guess we consider them immigrants, right? But they're Chilean citizens that come to live on Rapa Nui because, it's their right, because we're part of that country. But they bring in customs that are very foreign, and oftentimes very much in conflict of what our Pacific customs are. So this is sort of that strange Venn diagram gray space that we live in, because we are the only Pacific island that is governed by a South American country, right? So on the census, yeah, I do check that I'm Latino, but I also check that I am Asian Pacific Islander, because I often don't know what I should not check, right?
Yeah. The film really finds its center in the individual stories that you tell of these people who live on the island that are advocating for their communities. And they come from such diverse perspectives and points of view. And I think one individual who's incredibly central happens to be Mama Piru, right? So Arturo, can we watch clip number 3, in which Mama Piru is speaking about her cleanup efforts?
Ite monire pite hu mavau no au ko happy ai te pakego te basura no maiena e tai mahana mo tatu pira nui e ko tanu tatu ai tatuang i tatu ko ki tuke y orando todo kutangatu te hinua. Yo llamo a mi familia Juque, el 36 clanes de este moto. Yo soy uno de ellos. Tomarle posiciones de la limpieza que le corresponde a ellos. Esos son sus territorios ancestrales. O que hagan lo hago tu caída o no que hagan tu caída.
And I know that at one point she talks about how or it's spoken that at one point all the different clans were kind of put together in one area, right? Concentrated in one area. I'm really interested in kind of like the relationships between the clans or the families on the island. So could you tell us a little more about like the familial structures and maybe how they are similar or different to Western models or to traditional Latinx familial structures as well?
Yeah. We are a small, very related, interconnected community in Rapa Nui. At least the native Rapa Nui are to there. When I was growing up, when I was just a little kid on Rapa Nui, there were probably only about 4,000 people that lived there. Today, there's closer to 10,000 people, half of which are Rapa Nui. And if you look back further into sort of the history of our island, there was a point in the history of our island when there were only about 111 people, all Rapa Nui, because of a variety of issues, because of Western contact and disease and all of these things. And so we all are descendants from these 111 people. And that sort of, that lineage, that markage of family is really important for us, I would say, in Rapa Nui. And that information was often sort of held most by the grandparents, like the elders, So I would often, it would be difficult to date. I guess I would say that on Rapa Nui, because your grandparents would always call out that like, oh, that person is related to you because of this, like your fourth cousin removed from like another person or something like that. It's so. But the family structure has always been sort of really important to Rapa Nui, and you find this in other places in the Pacific too. Like there's a respect for the elders that is built in within that. For example, in the film, my dad talks about the terms of koro and nua. Like these were words that are referencing not only your mother and father, but also others of that generation that you must respect in the same way, and in many ways, when the culture was more tight knit, when there was less of us, there was more of a responsibility for the elders to watch over the little kids, and for the little kids to really sort of respect their elders and listen as closely to that uncle as you do to your own father, because in many ways that uncle also has the same responsibility as your father to keep you safe, to feed you, oftentimes to house you. It was not rare that an adult that didn't have children or couldn't have children would adopt other people's children and raise them as that. And so today there are sort of big last names on Rapa Nui. Mine, Rapu, is one of them, and we all trace back to different clans that initially existed, but because of all of the intermingling, there's not one specific clan to one family, right? But there is still very much that sort of connection to land, that understanding of which families live where, because even today, as I think, I find many Latino families and things, like we live very close to each other. And so there are areas of the island that, oh, that's where the Hawas live, that's where the Rapus live. Yeah, I mean, like family and community is incredibly important. And I think the more the diverse our community becomes, the more important it is for us Rapa Nui to maintain that connection, and we start seeing that all of a sudden when even sort of acquaintances call themselves Taina, brother, as opposed to just sort of calling each other by their name.
And I really love that sort of approach to lineage in this way that you structure and narrate your film, where it is like a letter, right, to your child, and you're trying to sort of create also the generational history and talk about how it's really important for him to understand that. I thought that was really lovely about the film.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about a couple of the other characters there. I maybe want to move to clip number 7, Arturo. So Enrique and Mahani are the two musicians that have a school. I think Enrique is a fascinating character, right? He talks about the tension between being an engineer and a musician as well. But in this clip, I think it's about productivity and the notion of living like a productive life versus a life for production. So if Arturo can play that clip, I have a question based on that for you.
Toda la gente tiene sus terrenos, pueden construir sus cabañas y generan sus recursos. Todos empiezan a generar. Se les olvida cómo siempre se vivió acá.
Yeah, so again, kind of that idea of living a productive life, right? Like a life that is fruitful of these relationships that you have versus just producing, living to produce. So I'm kind of wondering, I think he's alluding to, right, sacrificing one thing for the other. So how do you balance these values now, not living on the island, living in Minneapolis as you do, as an artist filmmaker, but also as, you know, as a father and family member as well?
Yeah, that's a great and somewhat difficult question. You know, spiritually and emotionally, I often, it's really difficult to not live there. You know, there's this importance to land, not only to connection with community and family, but also connection to land that is incredibly important. Not only for the Pacific, but I would say for like indigenous people around the world, right? This is what charges you. This is what roots you in sort of something beyond just your own existence, but reminds you of all of those ancestors that came before you, and you know that in many ways are still exist there, right? Um, um, and yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but like when it comes to productivity, you know, like how do we, this is, I think, ultimately like the big balance that my community is dealing with, and I would say in many other communities in the Pacific too, where we are trying to understand how do we maintain our uniqueness within our culture, understanding that culture changes, right? That we are not our ancestors, that our life is different now than it is then, but also, you know, fit into this other world that has been, you know, identified by the way the West does things, right? Mainly around sort of like the conversations around economy and growth and tourism and having sort of the necessities of life, I guess, if you'll put it that way. Balancing those things are difficult, and really making this film, I think, gave me kind of new perspective on those things. You know, I realized that older generations, I would say like my father's generation and even Mama Pito's generation, who, you know, they came from a time of scarcity, like tons of scarcity, one ship a year that came to the island. There wasn't a lot that was available. And so when things all of a sudden became available, they understood the importance of having those things because they come from a time where there wasn't much. Now in our generation, with me and Mahani and Enrique, we see the world a little bit differently. We understand that resources and connection to the outside, it doesn't always necessarily bring good things, you know? And so it's trying to understand how do we let in the positive things to our community, and still sort of try and filter out and learn from what other parts of the world have already learned from. You know, I think what makes all of our characters unique in many ways is that all of them lived away from Rapa Nui at some point in their life and then came back. And so then they bring with them sort of the understanding of how development could also impact negatively, you know? But I would still say that there is a sense of urgency to do something for everybody. It's not necessarily that like everyone's complacent and say like, oh, let's not do anything. There's this one point that like I remember in filming with Enrique, I was sort of following him around, and you know they're trying to build this school, and in many ways that's their sort of progress, right? He turns to me and he says, "I'm old already. Like I'm starting too late." And I look at him and I'm like, "You're only 30 years old." And he's like, "Yeah, like I have wasted 30 years of my life." You know? And so like sort of it put a different perspective on life's work, you know, for me. What are we doing with our lives? How do we define that? How are you like old enough to all of a sudden be ready to start the thing, you know? I don't think we're ever old enough to know what we are destined to do or what our meaning is. I think just like having kids, I would say now that I have two, there's never a right time to have kids, right? So
You touched upon so many of the questions that I have. I don't know which direction to go, but I'd like to actually keep going with Enrique, right? As I said, he talks about how he's known as a musician on the island, but he's also an engineer. And I feel like that seems to be the case with so many people on the island. There's this tension between kind of like what is appealing, you know, for the economic structure that we have versus like what will work for our community. So can we watch clip number 4, Arturo, about Enrique and Mahani and the music school? I just really want people to see like how amazing, you know, these structures are and the materials that he uses.
Al detonar esta energía de acá de la isla, va a mover a todos los continentes del planeta y a todas las personas que necesitan solamente un pequeño movimiento para dar más fuerza a hacer todo lo que en sus lugares están haciendo.
And I love the balance between, you know, repurposing all of this trash to create a sustainable building that has a function, but it's also super aesthetically pleasing as well. Like the way the light hit the different textures of the architecture is just amazing. I'm not sure if you can speak to this, but if you can you talk a little bit about the influences of maybe that helped Enrique create that building, maybe visually or materially? How does the architecture kind of reflect the philosophy of the school or maybe the values of the people of Rapa Nui?
Yeah. Yeah, the school is amazing. And it's, you know, it's a funny thing, like it came out of necessity. Mahani and Enrique needed a building, a structure in order to not only have their music classes, but they saw sort of a bigger vision of this place as a community center in many ways, and a safe place for young children in Rapa Nui to come and sort of a learning space, right? But they needed the space, they needed the physical structure. And so as, you know, sort of this globalized world works, like they not only looked internally, but also externally. And as they told me, like they discovered this building technique that was essentially developed by an American engineer in the Southwest. They're called earthship structures. And they discovered it by watching a bootlegged PBS documentary about this engineer from the 1990s or something like that. And so, you know, just thinking about sort of like the internet speed on Rapa Nui is like equivalent to dial-up. They're watching a bootleg documentary on YouTube to try and find a solution that may work, right, on Rapa Nui. And then, of course, all of that trash is our trash. But this sort of mixture, this intermingling of ideas was incredibly important for the structure to be built. However, the design itself was sort of developed, you know, to sort of embody Rapa Nui aesthetics and design. There's a lot of sort of petroglyph motifs on there. And right in the center of the structure, which unfortunately we don't see in the film, is sort of this amazing, I don't even know how to explain it, but it's this beautiful room that has sunlight sort of directly streaming down into it. Its acoustics are amazing, and I've been in there for some essentially chants and prayers and things before opening. And on sort of every corner, I want to say, you know, has like 8 corners to it, there is a precious rock from Rapa Nui, you know, whether it be one from that the Moai are made from, the tokis, right? Like the construction tools. But it always blows me away that a tool that was in many ways developed off the island was brought to the island and then sort of restructured to aid the community, you know. And I've heard this from another cousin of mine too, who's also kind of an archaeologist and has been through this process of leaving the island and coming back. And he says, because we were talking about it, right? I left the island to study film production, and now I'm trying to sort of figure out how to bring that back and use those tools to aid my community. And he really says, he's like, you pick up the raw materials outside, but you sharpen them here with your culture and your community, you know. And it's only with that in exchange that then it all of a sudden becomes effective, right? So it's I'm always blown away by that structure. And now they've taken all of the land around the school and have essentially turned it into farming and gardens to provide food and agriculture for the rest of the community for free. Wow. You know, so this sort of tool continues to be sharpened as it grows.
Okay, because in the film, it almost seems like, because it talks about how construction has not completed, but I for a while I was like, oh no, it was never completed. But hearing you say that, like, they've developed it in this way, like it's very heartening to me. I was just like, afraid that it wasn't. And then things I think
things just take longer on Rapa Nui, you know, for a variety of reasons. But if there's enough sort of, you know, love and mana, I guess, you know, what we'd call it, like, they get done.
So now I want to talk about tourism and culture. I think it's an aspect that really resonated with me and my work at the museum, because we often look at the work of artists who come from countries where the economy relies on tourism, and it affects, right, the way that they engage with their cultural traditions.
Hay mucho miedo.
¿Miedo de qué?
Las cosas que generalmente se hacen, como el trabajar la tierra, la agricultura, el enseñar a los niños, el mantener y preservar todo este legado que está acá, no son muy válidos. Y si se hace algo así, es como que se preserva, pero para el turista, ¿me entiendes? Y no para mí, para la persona.
So can you tell me a little bit maybe on how this dependence on tourism and this focus on exploring your culture, right, in this time when all these outsiders are coming in as an audience, has affected, like, your relationship with the culture, maybe some of the individuals that you know on the island? And then do you personally see a tension between traditional and contemporary expressions of that culture?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know an island that does not have tourism. And, you know, Auntie Fran, if you know one, please pop up and let me know. But there's something about just sort of geographically about islands that tourism tends to always be an aspect of our economy there. Even more so with Rapa Nui because of our past, because of our moai. You know, it's sort of one of the wonders of the world, and people want to see it. And oftentimes it was difficult, right, to get there. But now that, well, pre-COVID, it was a lot easier to get there. It sort of became an Instagram destination and, you know, all of that, right? And so I have never grown up in a time when there was never tourism on Rapa Nui. I, as well as the rest of my family, worked in tourism. My family has sort of a small hotel on the island. I remember giving tours. You know, it's sort of it's part of the process. It's part of the world, and in many ways, it's also sort of very difficult. It puts us in a very fragile state economically. And we're definitely seeing that now during COVID, when the island is completely closed off. There have been no tourists on the island since March of last year, which has forced the community there to return to a time when there was sort of this time of scarcity that we had talked about, like the importance of community becomes more important. The importance of each other helping to take care of one another and sort of feed each other becomes a lot more important. Because during this sort of time of tourism, there was a lot of money around, but we didn't produce our own food. There were agricultural fields, but not enough to sort of support all of the demand. So our dependence on goods from Santiago, from Chile, just was like through the roof, right? And now sort of like things have changed a little bit, and I hope kind of, many people are sort of realizing what our future after COVID could be like, so as to not be as dependent, around tourism. But in either case, like, I think tourism has brought its challenges to Rapa Nui, but also like its benefits. I often like to remind audiences that watch our film, that I am a product of tourism. The reason why I was able to study film production, move to the US to get a better education, that all was funded by tourism, and so there are also sort of benefits, more benefits on the island than there used to be, in terms of sort of wealth and things like that. So it's a complex topic, definitely. But I would say, to your other question, I mean, I think when we look at Tapati, for example, like this yearly festival, I would always ask my aunties and uncles about it, because you would always find that the same people always participate in the festival in terms of sort of the musicians and the dancers and things like that. And oftentimes, like, others would participate, but most of the time they would just be sort of spectators, if that, because the festival is also the busiest tourist time on Rapa Nui. So if you own a hotel, if you're a tour guide, you are like working day and night, right? So I remember many years that I was down there that I never got to see the festival because I was busy sort of, taking care of the needs of the tourists and things like that, or was just kind of too exhausted after the day of being with the tourists to like go down and be part of the festival. But I wouldn't say that tourism is, I wouldn't say that the practicing of our culture is only for the tourists, right? Like this is sometimes maybe like seen as a cliche a little bit, that like, oh, you don't actually dance your own dance, but you dance it when tourists come to watch it. And I think that it may have had that sense at some time, but even more now, I mean, I see the existence of song and dance and chant and things like that in familial contexts, right? At somebody's party, at a wedding or something like that, people will dance, right? And so that, as well as in Hawaii, in terms of like, and now you see it even in California, the numerous halau that are around, right, and sort of this perpetuation of culture and tradition. I think it's alive, and it lives outside of sort of the confines of sort of hotels and tours and night shows and things like that. And it's that part, and it's that part that I think continues to grow. The fear and what Enrique expresses here in this clip is the actual value placed on those things by others, like how do you feed yourself by being an artist? Well, you have to do that through this monetary exchange of goods. There are these amazing carvers on Rapa Nui, but the only way for them to be able to provide for their family is to carve the same little statue figures that the tourists will buy. if they carve something incredible and elegant, like very few people will actually buy that because maybe it's not sort of traditional art or
Yeah.
something like that, you know? Yeah. I know I'm sort of like I go off on these tangents when I'm answering your questions.
It's totally relevant. I
into
mean, I remember first working at MOLA and people would ask if, we had like indigenous textiles and things like that. And I had to remind them we are a museum of modern and contemporary art. Unfortunately, you won't see that, but you will see contemporary expressions that do reflect all of those traditions and those histories as well. We had a question in the chat that is relevant to the tourism question. So I think the question was, where do the majority of the tourists come from? And I think it referred to like maybe a global region.
Yeah, good question. I think I haven't checked on this recently. Obviously, like Chile would be like the biggest tourist, I would say, but it kind of equates to like how many Americans go to Hawaii every year, right? So that's kind of what that relationship would be. Beyond that, Europe, it feels like always had French and German tourists on the island, and then sort of then American, and also Asian cultures. I say specifically Japan. Kind of maybe sort of in that succession. Most recently, there's been sort of an influx of like Chinese tourists that have come, and maybe people from different parts of South America and things like that. But more often than not, I think it's just sort of European, and you see that reflected in sort of the need for language. English and German were kind of like the most needed language when it came to tour guides. Mm-hmm. So having there's in fact one agency that just does German tours because they were just so many of that, but yeah, really kind of from a lot of countries. Ultimately, it's still very expensive to get down there, so yeah. So from countries that don't, maybe there isn't like a high income or something like that, we wouldn't often see as many tourists, at least from there.
I'm going to switch lines. I'm going to wrap up this part where we talk individually, and I'm going to bring in Fran to have a conversation as well. I'm wondering, we're not going to focus on this, but I just had to chuckle in your inclusion of the whole like Kevin Costner debacle with the film that was made there. We're not going to focus on that. It's just a kind of hilarious part, but I think it's interesting how like that comes in sort of at the same time that like the dictatorship falls, and so there's like this all of a sudden this huge explosion of like consumerism. But we're not going to focus on that. Talk about stereotypes. So obviously the Kevin Costner film was full of stereotypes. I really recommend everyone watch the documentary to kind of see how that is treated. I think it's great.
Thank you. Thanks for, I don't want to get into it either, but I was so shocked by how many people, I would just, when we were doing interviews, I would say, what is the point of change in the development of the island? And everybody would reference to that time. It was just like so impactful, that I was like, well, not everybody is going to think that the production of this movie was so impactful, but everybody pointed to that time. So it just kind of goes to show that, these sort of like events, that happen in communities, like really change the trajectory drastically.
Yeah, that was incredible. But talking about stereotypes, and obviously that film was full of stereotypes. I think also the way that, and I've viewed the island, right, through the documentaries that I've seen or the specials that I've seen on TV, it's always framed as this like tragic story of an island where humans exploited nature. But then you have that clip where you're showing us the rock mulch gardens, right? Which speak both to like wisdom and knowledge of the land as well as ingenuity. So I'm wondering, I had never heard of that before. You always are told like there's no plant life on Rapa Nui, just rocks, right? How different would the story of the island be if it had always been told by those who are from there as opposed to outsiders? Like if you were to tell the story of the history, like what kind of, I guess, lens would you view it through?
As opposed to like, yeah, I
Sorry,
think
it's a big
no, for
question.
sure. I mean, like here's the thing, like, you know, especially, you know, doing documentaries and being a storyteller and things, right? There's always sort of a need to engage your audience and hook your audience, right? And so what, you know, the thing that is always returned to is like this mysterious island in the middle of the ocean, and nobody knows who built the statues and what happened, but all of a sudden they know that, you know, all the trees disappeared. So there's knowns and unknowns, right? And so this sort of like, I think we as human beings always want to feel like there are new horizons that we don't know, or like questions that all of a sudden we're going to be able to answer just by typing in the right Google search or something like that, you know? And so this sort of sense of sort of like mystery is essentially kind of what so many writers and television networks and things have just like based a lot of, you know, their storytelling on, right? And you can just like continue to kind of go down in the sort of spiral of like what if and what if and what if. I think that and we were seeing this often, like especially guiding tourists around in Rapa Nui, people come with sort of all these like questions, and then all of a sudden when they get the answer, it's kind of like, oh, okay, I guess it's not like what I thought it was, you know? Not to say that like, you know, it's like a depressing trip for them, but I think they start thinking about other deeper questions, right, that are actually mysteries on Rapa Nui. Because of this decline in our population down to 111 people, most of our history was not passed down. We are a culture of oral history, right? The job of my job and my ancestors' job was always to pass on our histories to the next generation. And there was a moment when all of that, the sort of transmission of information, was completely cut off, or nearly completely cut off. And it wasn't because of like when the aliens came, or when like all of a sudden all these like trees cut down. It was when Western contact happened. It was when disease was introduced, the island was raided by slave ships. A huge majority of people on the island died or were kidnapped in a very short period of time. And most of those people were elders and were men. And so the people that were left were sort of the younger kids who had fragments of an understanding of our past, right? And this is ultimately sort of the mystery of Rapa Nui, the mystery of the Easter Island, is understanding, trying to figure out of sort of these pieces of oral history that we have in connection with the science that archaeologists are sort of discovering and studying, like how it all fit together back then, right? But it always needs to come from, I think, a lens of cultural understanding. Like it's not enough for, and I'm sort of having this discussion too with this other person, but like it's not enough for somebody to come and take an artifact from Rapa Nui to the other side of the world and study it and think that they can understand the relevance that it has to Rapa Nui, right? The understanding of our past needs to happen within the context of our community. So I think about that when I try and tell the stories of my community and interview the people in my community. Because although everybody sees, you know, their life differently, I think there's kind of like a deeper truth that Native communities and at least in Rapa Nui can provide that is maybe even more not only entertaining but like sort of more enriching than sort of these like tried, you know, and like overdone mystery angles, right of the stories. I think there's sort of like a cheap way of telling a story, and then I think there's a much more difficult but truer way of understanding, right? And that just takes more time and oftentimes more access and more care of the culture. And sadly, you know, at least sort of commercial, you know, commercial production and things don't have the time or the resources or maybe the interest, you know, to go down this longer route. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I'm going to invite Fran to join us now. I have a couple of questions that I think both of you can respond to. And they are also kind of centered in the film. So I have a couple of more clips that we can share. And it does tie back into sort of the news that Fran gave us at the very beginning regarding all of the waste that's being thrown into the ocean. So I think I want to start with clip number 6, Arturo, where we see Ana Maria Gutierrez, who is an environmental engineer, talking about how waste accumulates on the island and then pollutes some precious resources there.
Si nosotros tenemos una mala disposición de nuestros residuos, pone en riesgo lo que es vital para el hombre y lo que es el agua. Efectivamente, la isla tiene una gran napa. Es como un gran pozo, una gran taza de agua, de la cual se va alimentando del agua de lluvia. El exceso de vehículos. Si yo tengo baterías, tienen metales pesados. Están a la intemperie y están mal dispuestas. ¿Qué me quiere decir que eso no se filtre y no llegue algo?
Cuénteme un poco sobre el sistema de reciclaje.
Para que resulte el tema de los envíos de residuos al continente para su reciclaje, es que tenemos que buscar alianzas estratégicas, digamos, y además pedir favores. Ya hemos hecho 5 envíos. La logística de lo que significa hacer eso es demasiado alta, digamos. Es complejo cuando tú estás a 4.000 kilómetros del continente. Tenemos que ir a hablar con la naviera o en este caso también con la Armada para que nos ayude a enviar los residuos. Después que el barco llega a Valparaíso, nosotros tenemos que además pagar la descarga. Claro, para la gente, ustedes venden los residuos. Sí, pero un kilo de cartón a mí me pagan 20 pesos.
So that's just one of the, I mean, that's kind of one of the most obvious issues. Obviously, when you're on an island, the garbage has nowhere to go. But I know that there are other issues that affect Pacific Island communities that are the results of consumerism, overdevelopment, and globalism, the way they're affecting the environment. So Fran and Sergio, can you share a little bit about maybe how island communities are tackling these issues? What kind of strategic partnerships or structures have they built up to deal with this?
Oh no, you don't want me to begin. So, you know, when people meet me, I say, come from a place of love, but it doesn't sound kind. And I'm unapologetic. Because I'm just, I can only speak on behalf of my people of the island of Guahan. As you know, with over 20,000 islands, more than 20,000 islands, it's hard for me there's no one expert or anything like that. So if you are from Puerto Rico, you will understand the Chamorro people's plight of being a U.S. territory. So there's so many things that are happening there in our environment. We can't access because they're building a firing range, and we can't even go in there to bury our bones and meet our ancestors, right? Because it's run under the U.S. government. So we have a love you, hate you relationship going on right now, and we don't. And I'm very much involved with all of that. I don't step away just because I'm out here. I'm in constant. It's just I'm asking for their statement also in Japan. So it's hard because, especially for Guan, I can only speak on that behalf. Many times because it's part of the U.S. government, we don't even get a vote. I mean, our congressman is really not, he's more of a delegate. So yes, we can serve the military, but yet we can't vote, right? So we are activating, and it is this new generation of also from the diaspora who are out here and our people in our homelands. They're working in together. So, you fight fire with fire and stone to stone. So there's a council person or a senator or the governor who has some ties to that. Then we activate from here, from our diaspora, to say, hey, these are affecting our islands and our nation and our people. So give us access, give them access. So it is that constant, and it's obviously the artists and the academics are at that forefront of mobilizing all of that activity and speaking at the United Nations. So they're getting to the door. But for some of our islands, we don't even get to that door because, we hold a different type of passport. So I'm going to stop there because there's a lot. Even the Kanakamelis are going through so much. Everything is stolen land, but there are generations now. Just get ready. Just get ready.
Thank you for that. I think I feel a lot of what you're saying, especially when it comes to Rapa Nui. I think for in terms of sort of partnership, in terms of trash and sort of pollution, we are fortunate enough that because Rapa Nui did not, I don't know if develop as quickly, is the right term, but like we are not as developed as, say, Hawaii, Honolulu, with sort of massive structures and massive needs and demands and things. Even Tahiti, Papeete, is larger than us in terms of the amount of cars and tourists and trash and things like that. And so our remoteness has sort of kept our development slow. And that also kind of equates to that if you look back, kind of as I was saying earlier, you only need to look back like 1 or 2 generations to a point where people were completely dependent on the land in order to survive, or there was a balance between a subsistent culture and the few goods that you got from the mainland every once in a while. And those goods, man, they were used as slowly as possible because you're not going to get another can of beans or something for like another year or 6 months. In fact, in our language in Rapa Nui, there's this term called petietahi, which means, it describes something good or fantastic. But peti means peach, right? It's referring to like that is peachy in reference to like a can of peach, because a can of peach is, if you've tried it, is really sweet and juicy and amazing, right? And so the what is all behind all of this is that like just a generation ago, we understood sort of like the scarcity of products, but also of those goods, like that peach aluminum can could be reused for different purposes, right? And oftentimes was like shared within other family members if you're using a thing. My mom even tells me stories about like washing out plastic bags, and putting them up on the clothesline because they can be used for other things, right? So now I kind of like laugh a little bit when I look at the reuse, reduce, recycle triangle, because I was like, oh, my community was at reuse, like, not too long ago. And here sort of, at least in the US, the default is like, oh, I'm just going to throw it in this recycling bin. Like I'm doing my part for the world by giving it to somebody else to take care of. And so like, I think the sort of like, because we still maintain that understanding to a certain extent, the community on Rapa Nui has tried to be really active in figuring out how to restrict or how to reuse particular items that typically are just trash, and to some successes, but then others not, like in the film, as we show, like Mama Piru used guilt, I would say, and sort of like communal shaming as another really great tactic. Take care of your garbage, or Mama Piru would come on the radio and yell at you for it, and everybody would hear about it, right? So in a small community like ours, like that is an effective way of having people clean up their mess. The conflict comes when like you can't shame those tourists that are coming, right? Or that the demand requires that you provide a thing because there's this exchange, right? You're going to give me money, but you want something that's not made from here, so then I'm going to give you pasta and a Coke that also came on the airplane that you just came off of, right? So I think what Rapa Nui has slowly started doing, I see that really often, is it also is not only sort of returning to some of the cultural values about resource preservation and honestly just respect to land, but also then there's this other step of like educating the person that is coming that does not hold those values, right? And showing them the importance of that. In the end, we are just a tiny island, and we are, I think, hopefully through films like this and through stories of different parts of the Pacific and even art, like we can expand sort of these lessons beyond the restraints of our island. But ultimately, I think the issue of trash is a very personal one. If somebody decides to take an action or not, that's everybody's choice. It just, sadly, it happens at a global scale,
I want to leave some time for our audience to ask questions. So now is the time. If you haven't popped a question into the chat or into the Q&A, please feel free to do so. I'm going to skip this one question and go to one in the Q&A here from Patrick Frank, asking, how useful has it been for Rapa Nui people to make common cause with other indigenous groups in Chile, such as Mapuche?
Yeah. I would say I don't know much about that, but there is a strong connection between all of the indigenous groups in Chile. Like we see that very often. We see representatives from Rapa Nui having cultural exchanges in Chile, having and even to the point of having discussions around sort of legal rights, land rights, things like that, right? There has been, not only in terms of conflict with us, the Rapa Nui and the Chilean government. Obviously, there has also been with Mapuche, with the other indigenous people in Chile, and so, but when I compare at least the Chilean government's relationship with the indigenous community there and the US relationship with the indigenous community here, I often see maybe it being indigenous people having more of a voice in Chile than they do here, even though they don't necessarily have full representation in the government, there is, at least a sense of respect, attributed to them, and an ear for the most part. Now, if action is actually taken or not, that's always who's in power. But.
Yeah. We have a question actually that relates to language from Denise in the chat. How much does the Rapa Nui language influence the Spanish spoken there and vice versa?
So Spanish is our government language, I guess I would say. We speak Spanish because of Chile. But like my grandmother speaks Spanish very poorly, like her first language was Rapa Nui, the native language. And there was a time too, even when I was growing up, and we talk about it a little bit in the film, of that, like, learning the Rapa Nui language was not as important as being able to master Spanish or even English, right? And so even now, today, with two kids in tow, I'm trying to master better my indigenous language, my Rapa Nui, where there are children today on Rapa Nui that are learning it in school. So so I think that there's this sort of like element, this is like pendulum swing, of like, oh, the outside is good. We need to be able to compete outside. You need to be able to get a good job outside. And so forget about Rapa Nui, try to adapt to this other way of life. And then when all of a sudden we start seeing sort of the loss of culture, specifically around the loss of language, then sort of government institutions help to try and bring the pendulum back. But I did not learn Rapa Nui growing up. And I think because of it, there are elements of my culture that I don't understand completely, because there's so much meaning behind just small words or small phrases. So that's something I'm trying to get back, but I don't know if I ever will, sadly.
It's something we're always talking about at work too. Every once in a while, we have to just say something in Spanish because we can't find the words for it in English. And so we'll just break English. I just don't know how to say that in this language. So forgive me if I throw this in. So we still have time for a few more questions. I have one more question for both you and Fran. So there's a part of the film that shows the resistance of the people on the island through tourists kind of blocking off the highly desirable areas of the island that wanted to be visited. Can either of you speak to either historical or contemporary movements where communities come together or have come together to establish self-determination and more control of their resources? And if so, can you maybe share some of that information with our audiences? Where can they find more information on that? Any handles you want to drop in the chat?
Go for it, Auntie Fran.
We saw at the end of my talk, it was this, right? It's the Mauna Kea. So we start with so the Kanaka Maoli and just with, it's a family. It's a mother and daughter, and hearing an ancestor talking to another, and people thinking, you sound crazy because you hear spirit voices, and that's how that whole responded. But that fight has been going on for a long time to save Mauna Kea, and it's continuing. So that legacy, so that is one, and there is a film out that you can also find. We are all part of, Sergio and I were all part of the same it's VC Media. They do every year's the API Film Festival also pick, and I'll probably put all those resources where you can find those films of how it started out with that family. But I'm going to start from Mauna Kea and that whole surgery.
Yeah. The film. Well, I think there's a couple, but there's a film called Standing Above the Clouds. That was made by some filmmakers about the movement of trying to, in many ways, like protect Mauna Kea, which is an incredibly important sacred mountain in Hawaii for the Kanaka, for the indigenous people there. And it has been a fight. It continues to be a fight for that community. And I think in many ways, like, the fight brings the community together, right? It's sort of like everything else drops away, and the most important things like prevail and stay there. So this is also sort of been a discussion around, it's really all started around sort of the government or researchers or a company wanting to install this this massive telescope up there. It would be like one of the most impressive in the world, but at the same time they're installing it in a place that's incredibly important for people, and so then the conversation is always like who's is most important. But it's a moving movement. It's an incredibly inspiring act, that has been happening in Hawaii. And in terms of Rapa Nui, like we talked a little bit about our own sort of rebellious nature, as a community, of like how do we assert things that are really important to us. And like the Rapa Nui, my community, we can be vicious, I guess, when we need to be, there are times that people have just decided, that enough is enough, and we need to really make a stand. And the way that we do that is doing it publicly by limiting or closing access to the place that makes us the most unique, right? The moai. If hundreds of thousands of tourists can't come to see our island or these moai because of this political issue, well, it brings attention to that political issue. And recently, sort of in, when COVID was taking over the world, it was the Rapa Nui community that petitioned and pushed for the airline to stop flying to the island. It was not, it did not come from the Chilean government to say, oh, wait, there are only, 3 ICU beds on this island. We need to protect this population. It was the population that went out and threatened to sit on the runway and stop any planes from coming in, because COVID coming into that island would completely decimate my culture and my community. So I think it's important for us, as Indigenous people, and oftentimes feeling as very small fish in sort of this bigger political context, to have these loud voices, to be able to be heard. And I think, in the case of especially Mauna Kea, it's just like completely inspiring. And in some ways, and I think kind of like also returning back to this sort of, preservation of ocean and aina, there are the hokulea is in many ways, I kind of see it as that, the hokulea is this double hold canoe, and that for a long time has been the vessel, literally, but also figuratively, of restoring voyaging techniques, ancestral voyaging techniques in Hawaii, voyaging by the stars, right, and understanding the wave patterns and things like that. But when this hokulea and its crew decides to circumnavigate the world in order to bring attention to the destruction that is happening to our oceans, like that is also a call to arms, right? That is a show of that is a way of using our culture and our art to bring attention to something incredibly important right now. So I'll stop talking, but I think in many ways, like, protest doesn't always look like protest. Art can be can definitely be that too, So.
We do have one more question from our audience that I want to address. And then after this question, I'm going to ask you to give us a little more, I'm going to ask both of you to give us a little more information about your respective projects. Let us know how we can continue supporting you, or we can find your work. But this question is from an anonymous attendee. They say, thank you so much for your film, Sergio. How was the process of editing interview segments of such different views in regards to the future of Rapa Nui, in particular, your dad's?
That was the hardest one. Editing my dad was the hardest one. Because I'm so aligned with the way that he thinks about things. Obviously, because he's my dad, because I've learned so much from him. He is my tupuna, you know, he's my elder. And I think, you know, my wife reminds me of this too, you know, and she gives me kind of an outside perspective that oftentimes people see Indigenous films or read Indigenous stories as being the one voice, you know, this is how Native people must think. This is what Polynesians think. But if you really look at our communities, like we are as diverse in ideas as we are people and ages, you know? And so it was incredibly important for us. And we kind of figured this out like after we had identified people to have these complex viewpoints, because that is ultimately an honest portrayal of how people think in Rapa Nui, you know? It is based on your life experience. It is based off of so many other things. And we thought it was really important to be able to show the diversity of thought within even a small community. Because that is the truth, you know? And in the end, you know, I think, you know, my dad's stance about the importance of development when it comes to the island, but I guess the importance of us as Rapa Nui to be able to control the development on the island is kind of where I stand also, you know. I realize that there is no stopping it. And so it is important for us to really understand what is happening, you know.
Yeah, and cultures are never static. They're always dynamic, right?
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I would like to tell our audience that the film will be available for a few more days. So if you received the link, you can go ahead and watch it. And if you are joining us, or if you are watching on YouTube and you'd like to watch the film, please go to mola.org and go to our Asian Pacific Islander Latinx Festival. And when you register, you won't be able to join the talk because it's over, but you'll be able to watch the film. But Sergio, would you like to give a little more information? Maybe drop your website in the chat or tell us about any upcoming projects, festivals you might be participating in that we might watch out for?
Yeah, my wife and I recently just finished a short that is called Distant Learning. It's actually at the Cannes Film Festival playing today. I guess it started this week. We are, I'm actually in the process of producing another film about missing and murdered Indigenous women here with a Dakota filmmaker in Minneapolis. So we hope that will be done by the end of the year and make its festival rounds and eventually land on a PBS broadcast.
Congratulations on everything.
Thank you.
Fran, do you want to give us a little more info on PIAM, maybe when you think you all will be reopening?
Oh, yes, my staff of myself. Yes, I am a staff of myself and lifted up by the community and of artists. So we will reopen actually next week, but only Wednesday through Friday. We're obviously across our sister museum of Mola, and but our hours are limited because I am also everything, and these guys all know this. I'm everything. You'll see me outside. Right now we have in the exterior of our fences, we're part of We Rise. So we have an exterior exhibit going on in response to mental health. And it's led by our artist in residence, Jason Pereira, who's a muralist. And JP's in-house with me as often as he can. but what he has done with his friends and his son, so they have painted these art panels that actually were the wood pieces that were used to put up on our buildings and when there was, protests and big riots in downtown Long Beach. And I had to do my best to say, I can't save everything, but I'm going to do my best to save my ancestors that are temporarily residing at Payam. So when you see the pieces, they're actually facing the street and facing the park, because where we sit in our space, we're at that crux of our triangle of the undocumented, the human trafficking, the gang violence. There's just so much, the unsheltered. So the panels are, the art pieces are there. So if the community, it's to say, we got you, we see you, we know you. And in our own Pacific Islander style, and the colors are vibrant. There's one that says rest. There's one that's facing the other side of the park that says ask permission. Ask permission. And that's, when speaking of Sergio, what he's saying with our own communities. So we're just asking that. So you'll see that. So that is going on through the month of May. And then Pacifica Transmission is an online programming, and you can find that on our website. And that Alaweo is one of the persons. So we have one more artist, Mariquita Davis. And Sergio knows who she is. So Mickey Davis, we call her Mickey, but she's also cinematographer, documentarist. She's been leading this Pacifica Transmission, but it's very different. Pime holds a different space. We are in that, there's no old and new. So there are ancestor pieces, because without them, there's no us. And so the artists are coming in once a month, the old indigenous bloodline, and most of them are SoCal based, and they spend time to listen to an ancestor. And then they are creating pieces. They spend like almost a month in and out and just really listening. So you can hear what they all have to say. But we decided to create an exhibit based on the stories. As Sergio would say, there's no one story. And sometimes the story that is coming to them is just a story for them. And it's not for anybody. And then the lesson changes. And that's really, our indigenous way of storytelling. The story is full because it's full. It's full. And there's no one perspective. And because it's really just geared towards you and your family and that one individual. So Pacifica Transmission will also open, but it's a process. So when you see it, so there is a sale from Pulawatt, and there's a mural painted behind it by JP. When you come in, it will be the first thing. And so our world is small. So Dr. Vince Diaz, our world is small. Our island people, we just all know each other. And then if you're academic, so Vince is basically the scholar and a friend, and actually his wife is my childhood friend of a lifetime, and they work with us. So Vince has also helped us with the sale from Pulawatt, and because we asked the artists when they spent time. So you will hear the voices of the artists, and most of it is the voices of that ancestor, because that ancestor is really saying, remember me. But so when you come in, you'll see some of their pieces out there, and then and then we also have a house inside the house, and Gabby has been there. So it is a house that we ask people to have permission. We hold ceremony in there, and every day is a ceremony. And so so I will be there as often as I can. And please, everybody, come up. Sergio, when you come back. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I'm still sort of fearful of getting on airplanes, but I'll be there one day.
Yeah, and then just grab Vince and Tina and the kids and all the kids.
Well, thank you so much again, Sergio and Fran. I've learned so much from both of you. This has been amazing. Thank you for the work that you do and for sharing your stories and your wisdom. And thank you for our audience members. We are continuing our programming next week. Next week's program, the focus is on detention and resistance, talking about the legacy of detention in both Asian American and Latinx communities. And we're organizing this in partnership with the Japanese American National Museum. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, and we hope to see you all very soon. Good night.
Good night.